Let's get right into the issues then. Let's dive right in. You did mention China. Ray Dalio at a Forbes event last week said this about China, which continues to be an emerging issue. The relative position of the United States has declined and the relative situation in China has risen. And he wrote in April that he believes the US and China are, quote, on the brink of war and beyond the ability to talk. Do you agree with him? Do you think the situation is that dire, A? And B, what would you do to fix it?
Unfortunately, I do agree with him. I think that the U.S. Has had a posture of weakness in the world, which has precipitated its enemy's aggression. We saw that with Vladimir Putin invading Ukraine. We're seeing that now with China that has set up not only a spy base in Cuba, but now today's reports in the Wall Street Journal are that they're setting up training bases in Cuba. So I think China is becoming more aggressive, and it's worrying not just our country, but it's worrying its neighbors, Japan and Korea. So I think Ray Dalio is right. I think we have to take the $1 trillion of net wealth that we send them on an annual basis in the form of our trade deficit and the IP that they steal annually. We need to use that to reinforce our own interest. We need to bring back our supply chain and nearshore it here in our country and in our hemisphere. We need to use those resources to create allies so that we don't have a rise in socialism like we're seeing in our hemisphere, which before was basically Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua. Now we're seeing left regimes in Mexico, in Brazil, in Colombia, in Bolivia, in Argentina, in Chile. I mean, this is getting out of control. And we have no coherent strategy to deal with it as a country. And then on top of that, we're seeing them broker peace between Saudi, and Iran. And we're also seeing them pump fentanyl through our border, which is killing 80 to 90,000 Americans annually. That's the equivalent of a 747 crashing every single day. So I actually think the threat is even more dire and pronounced than Ray says, but we have to confront it immediately.
So, how specifically, let's say you're president, it's day one, how specifically would you quell China's aggression? He said we're beyond the ability to talk. How would you get China to the table? Would you speak to them? What does that look like?
Well, it looks, first of all, like us regaining the economic wealth that we're sending them. We have to start that immediately, whether it's through tax policy or whether it's creating incentives for American companies to nearshore our supply chain. They have to understand that they are giving our supply chain to someone who is becoming an adversary or who is an adversary and increasingly becoming more hostile to the United States. We have to protect Taiwan. And we have to project a strength in Taiwan. I think the fact that Secretary of State Blinken just went to China and reinforced this administration's policy that Taiwan is a subject to China's control and is a province of China is exactly the wrong answer, particularly when 90% of our advanced microchips are being produced in Taiwan. Do we want the country to come to a halt if China invades Taiwan and us not to have telephones, not to have weapon systems, not to have cars that function, that rely on that technology? I mean, that's crazy. And then you got to deal with the border. You need to treat it like the crisis that it is and make sure that China cannot use fentanyl to kill Americans. And of course, have a hemispheric strategy and deal with Cuba, not just as an ideological threat, but as the national security threat that it's becoming.